Well, again, I want to welcome everyone today for the NODP webinar. My name is Bridget Brown, and I am the Executive Director of the National Association of Workforce Development Professionals. NODP is a membership organization, and we are dedicated to supporting workforce development professionals who work in a variety of settings across the country and on our military bases in Europe and in Asia. And as you can see from some of the slides that have been scrolling on your computer screen, we've got a really busy next couple of weeks coming up with some webinars and events. A lot of the events that you see on the screen right now are free, such as the Applying for Your CWDP webinar and some of the thought leader discussions and Facebook chats that are coming up. So it's going to be a really busy couple of weeks, and we hope to offer a lot of different opportunities for our members. Of course, we do have our annual conference, which is coming up in May in Minneapolis, and I hope to see all of you there. We've got some really great presenters and some workshops that I think are really designed to meet the needs of all type of different practitioners. This year we have a focus on serving veterans and also serving older workers as well. All right, so enough about me. Let's talk about today's webinar, and we're going to talk about the training strategies to improve job retention. And as part of that, a couple of housekeeping announcements. The webinar is sold out, so we're going to have a full house today. And this is where I normally go in and say, hey, let's test out that chat feature. But I can see from all of the folks who are on here already, you already get the chat feature, so we don't even need to test that out. I've seen a couple of people already telling us that they're here, and they're excited and ready to go. But we will be stopping along the way today to take your questions, so please do use that chat feature to type in your questions. And if you have a question throughout Josh's presentation, don't hesitate but to type it in there. I have put the slides from today's presentation up on the website, and I've put them in the chat feature and sent them out to you, and I'll send them out to you again with the link. We are recording this webinar, and as soon as I get it posted, I will send you out a link to where you can view it or have some of your colleagues view it as well. For those of you who are certified workforce development professionals or who will be applying for this credential, this webinar will cover 3 competency areas: career development process, communication, and business and employer knowledge. And just a word about the CWDP. Earlier this month, we announced some big changes that are coming to the CWDP credential, and you can check all of that out in the March issue of the newsletter. And also, we have that on the homepage of our website, www.nodp.org. And these new competencies will go into effect on August the 1st. And remember, the next deadline to apply for your CWDP is April the 30th. And I'll be doing a webinar on April the 2nd to help everyone understand the process. Alrighty, so enough about me, enough about NODP. I am really pleased today to be joined by Josh Davies. Josh is currently the CEO of the Center for Work Ethics Development. It's an organization that is committed to restoring work ethic values in high school, workforce centers, and the private sector. He is also a published author and is frequently cited in national publications, including the New York Times. He has an honorary doctorate of food service by the North American Food Equipment Manufacturers Association for his contributions to the hospitality industry. He's the past president of the Council of Hotel and Restaurant Trainers and been appointed by the governor of Colorado to serve on the Colorado Workforce Development Council and is co-chair of the State Youth Council. He's made presentations to a variety of organizations across all 50 states, including America's Society of Training and Development. And in preparation for the 2008 Democratic National Convention, he led training for all 10,000 volunteers and more than 4,000 local service professionals for this event. Training Magazine recently named him as one of the top trainers under 40 in America, and the Denver Business Journal tapped him as one of Denver's 40 under 40. So as you can tell, he is well-versed in the training field. And with that, I am going to turn over the presentation to Josh, and he's going to talk to us about how we can improve job retention. Josh, are you there? You may need to unmute yourself. Here we go, Josh. Hey, there we go. I love technology when it works.
Well, great. Well, Bridget, thank you very much for that introduction. Far too kind, and I obviously owe some money to whoever wrote it. I'm not sure who that person is they're introducing, but I'm glad that at least I get a chance to be here on the phone with you and present today's webinar. I just wanted to let everybody know a little bit about what we're going to be talking about as we go through this process today, but also just about our organization to begin with, and then what you all can do, because at the end of the day, what's most important is how we can all work together to help deal with retention, regardless of whether or not that's looking at things from a client side, a community side, or even within your own business. Again, my name is Josh Davies. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the Center for Work Ethic Development. We're an organization based in Denver, Colorado, but with clients across the country. If you're looking to get in touch with me or our organization, you can email me at the address you see below at jdavies@workethic.org. Though I'm going to warn you, I will not be answering emails during this webinar, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't either, though I know the urge is there. If you'd like to find out more about our organization, you can also go to www.workethic.org. Today, we're going to be covering a variety of different topics. We're going to start by really focusing on turnover across the United States and where we have some impacts and some of the different types of turnover. Then we'll talk about some of the costs, and we'll focus on some business costs, but also some of the statistics we have around how important it is from a community basis in terms of how long people are retained, what that does, and the impact it has from a bottom line as well as from an individual standpoint. Then we'll look specifically at this idea of involuntary turnover, and that's really a focus that we have. Most of the information that's going to be coming from the presentation in the webinar today came as a result of a white paper that we released at the Center for Work Ethic Development in December of last year called Whose Job Is It? It was focused on strategies for improving job retention and really looked a lot at this idea of involuntary turnover. And so that's where these are going to come from, as well as, most importantly, how you can build job retention. And regardless of where you are, whether or not you're a community and faith-based organization, whether or not you're a one-stop, whether or not you're a private contractor, whether or not you're a service provider, you can use some of these strategies that we've discovered and integrate them into what you're doing to help improve your job retention for your job seekers, for your clients, and for your community. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. The Center for Work Ethic Development has been around now for 5, almost 6 years. We were founded in 2007. We're the nation's only institution that's focusing on work ethic and how to help make sure that people have the job behaviors they need in order to be successful. Our programs are available for all sorts of different organizations, used at over 500 locations nationwide. There may be many of you here on the webinar who have used one of our different programs in the past. You may be most familiar with the Bring Your A Game to Work program. We also have a team version of that. And our business-to-business side is called Align, that works on how to help create cultures within different companies and management and leadership strategies and tactics for building a culture of work ethic as well. With that in mind, let's talk about why we're all here today and the whole idea of turnover in the United States. And even during the recessionary time that we've had over the past several years, what an impact turnover has and how significant it is across the United States, across industry, across region. So we're going to start by looking at just a snapshot in time. And this we're going to look at is September of 2012. September 2012 we chose because it was not only a period of time that we were doing the research for the white paper, but it was a pretty typical month in our post-recessionary era as we're sort of climbing out and attempting to build back that job base. Here's what we found. During the month, almost just slightly over 4 million people were separated from their jobs. Now, they fell into 3 different categories. Not everyone was separated because they were let go. In fact, what you find here is that really the number of people who quit was higher than the number of people who were laid off. You can see 49% of the people who left, or almost 2 million, chose to do so willingly. That's voluntary turnover. 42% were results of layoffs and discharge, and 9% were other. Just to use some statistics and some definitions around these, this all comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and here's how they define each of those 3 different groups, because I think that's really important as we move forward. Number 1, quits. Right? These are people who leave voluntarily. They may have another job already lined up. They may be moving to a different part of the country. They may stay in the industry. They may leave out of the industry. They may just get so fed up with a job that they quit even when they don't have one. Those are voluntary. That's voluntary turnover, and that's the quits. The second piece are layoffs and discharges. These are involuntary separations that are initiated by the employer. These are like when people get laid off with no intent to rehire. Positions are eliminated, downsizing, but really one of the more major reasons why people are in this category is because of firings or other discharge for cause. So that's the second category. And again, remember that made up 42% of the total number of people who were let go. So almost 1.75, 1.8 million people in September alone. The third, just so you know what that other category is, because there's always that other category. In this case, other separations are retirements, transfers, deaths, disability leave, those kinds of things that are not really easily tracked in any of the other areas. Now, there's been a lot of research done and a lot of focus by a variety of different companies across the private sector that really are focusing on the quits and this voluntary turnover, right? How do you get people more engaged? How do you keep employees happy? How do you keep them from wanting to quit you? And there's a lot of great research. There's great books, speakers, but what we found was really missing in the workplace was this idea of how do we focus not just on the quits, but the people who are being involuntarily terminated. Sometimes you look at those people and say, well, it's their own fault they got fired. But what we started to do as we got into the research was to look a little bit more into why this happened and what the impact of it is. Now, when you look at layoffs and discharges, typically, again, I said September was kind of an average month. What you'll see here is a 6-month trend from September all the way back to April of last year. Again, all from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, looking at the number of people who were laid off or discharged in the thousands per month. And so you see that number, again, hovers right around 1.6 million. In some months this is high, like May was a really high month. It was almost 2 million people. But it's really within that 15 to 16, 1.5 to 1.6 million range per month. And so you see that on an ongoing basis. So it's very consistent across the board. Now, involuntary turnover itself, what you see is there's different cycles. In the economic cycles during a non-recessionary time, you see that most involuntary turnover is from discharge as the economy starts to go south. So as you looked at 2007, 2008, what you saw was that the majority of the layoff from involuntary turnover was a result of downsizing. It was not because people were not performing, it's because they were getting laid off. And so that's an important piece to note as we look at these numbers. Now, what we're starting to see, however, and this was beginning last year and even now so even more as the new year and the new numbers come out, is you look at why people leave an organization in terms of involuntary reasons and voluntary reasons. This is from a study from an organization called Opportunity Knocks that looked at why people were leaving and some different percentages, whether or not that was for personal family, job dissatisfaction, competitive job, right? All 3 of those reasons would be voluntary turnover as opposed to disciplinary and layoff, which would be involuntary at the top. You can see that family and personal reason makes up a little less than 8%. Dissatisfaction with the job is about 1 in every 10 employees. That's why they left. A more competitive job, just a little bit over that. But what's really interesting about the study that they did were these last 2 bars, which were layoff and disciplinary. Not because they were that large, because they're not significantly larger than the other one. But what was important is that this was the first time last year that this study found that the disciplinary reasons for layoff equaled to or were more than the layoff itself. So what you see here is that the tide is turning, and we're moving away from an environment where more people are losing their jobs for layoffs as opposed to being fired for cause. That's an important distinction as we move forward, because what you're going to see are these trends around involuntary turnover leaning more and more towards discharge for cause, people getting fired, and less from the layoffs that we started to see during this past recession. So the other thing you need to know, though, is even during those times where most of the discharge happens as a result of layoffs. Layoffs oftentimes are really just disguises for firing someone for cause. You see a lot of organizations anecdotally who talk about laying off people because of poor performance and the people they choose and how they choose them. So the Society for Human Resource Management, otherwise known as SHRM, and some of you may be members of SHRM as well, in their 2011 Layoff and Job Security Survey, they looked at why, what were the reasons why people chose which employees to let go during a layoff. And the results of those probably don't surprise anyone. Type of employee, so maybe that particular, we're trying to get rid of full-time employees to go to part-time or vice versa. They don't have the right skills. We're eliminating an entire job category. But what you saw was that 62% of the time, one of the reasons that people considered laying someone off, the number one reason, was because of their job performance. So what you see more than anything is that these layoffs really oftentimes are just disguised ways of firing employees. The reason that's important, again, is because no one has really done a lot of research into why employees get fired, or, more importantly, how to prevent it. And that's what we looked at in this white paper. If you were to take a total look at the entire year of 2012, and you just broke it down in terms of discharged employees, what you'd find is, if we use a conservative estimate, so there were about 20 million, we estimated 20 million people were going to be either laid off or discharged in 2012. We just checked the numbers again from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who compiled all of last year, and in fact it was slightly higher. It was 20 million and a half, so 20.5 million people were laid off or fired last year. If we go with a very conservative estimate and say that 60% of those people were laid off and 40% were fired for cause and discharged, that means that last year we had 8.5 million people get fired in this country. And while you may look at those people and go, well, it's your own fault, you didn't, you obviously did something stupid at work to get yourself fired, what we need to realize is the impact that it has on industry, our communities, our country, and for some of you in the workforce world, right? It's one of your common measures that you get measured on in terms of your success, is that job retention figure. So we've got to figure out a way to have fewer people get fired and more people retaining their jobs. So before I head into this next section here where we talk about the cost of turnover, I wanted to pass it back over to Bridget and see if we had any good questions or things that needed to get answered from the first segment that we did.
I don't have any in, but let's go ahead and ask for them. If you have any questions on what Josh has gone over already, go ahead and use your chat feature. The questions coming in about whether or not they can get a copy of the white paper. Cheryl, yes, I will send that out when I send the link to the recording. So we will make sure that you get that. I should have gone ahead and posted it already. Just another little housekeeping. I'm seeing that some people are logging in multiple times. We are a full house today. And if you log on multiple times, that means somebody who has registered at the beginning is not going to be able to get a seat. So just a warning on that. So we will be having to go through and dismiss some folks who are in here multiple times. Any other additional questions?
And I'll tell you this, Bridget, there's nothing more embarrassing than getting discharged during a webinar on discharge. All right, so those of you out there who are logged in multiple times, make sure that you do it so that it becomes voluntary, not involuntary.
Yes, always going to be voluntary. Yes, we will send the white paper out to everyone. You can get a copy of the slide presentation online, and I will also send that out to you, but it's online, and I've been posting the link in the chat feature as well. I can go ahead and do that again with no problem. Any other questions? I don't see any right now, but feel free to, if something else comes up during the presentation, you can go ahead and use that chat feature, and then Josh will get to that at his next break.
Great. Thank you, Bridget. So the next section that we have in our webinar is really talking about the cost of turnover. And this is going to focus a lot on our business partners. And while for some of you, as you look at this, you may go, well, I don't run a business. It's not important to me. One of the important things for all of us as we interact with the employers in our communities is to understand the impact that this has on them so that we can make a convincing argument as to why certain things are important, why certain training is important, why certain candidates are better than other candidates because they've received certain training, because it will affect them and their bottom line. So it's really important for you to understand some of the basics of the numbers, regardless of whether or not you're actually running a business yourself, you're a business unit manager, or whether or not you're working as an outside group as a faith-based or government organization. So as we look at the cost of turnover, one of the important areas is to look at how we kind of measure this and what we look at when we look at a cost of turnover. The challenge for most organizations is that they don't have a specific line on their P&L around turnover. It's really difficult because it's hidden in a lot of different places. You look at places like productivity. One of the things that's really difficult to quantify is that institutional knowledge, right? The person who used to know all the clients, or where you order paper from, or sometimes something as silly as how you get the coffee machine to work, right? That's institutional knowledge, which has a business impact. How much it costs to recruit the person, whether or not you're using a headhunter, whether or not you're going online, the time that's wasted in recruiting someone new, and also the additional training costs that go into getting the new person up to speed as you look at trying to get back to full productivity. Now, when you look at that, there's a lot of different ways that you can estimate turnover cost. And because there are so many variable factors in so many different places, there are countless studies that are there. What we looked at when doing our research was a meta-study that analyzed 20 different impacts of turnover and looked at the cost over those 20 and averaged them out, because some of them are extreme and some of them are not. For instance, the Society of Human Resource Management, again, that SHRM study, said that for an $8 an hour employee, right, your basic employee, it still costs about $3,500 to replace one of them. The American Management Association estimated instead that for management associates, it's between 100 to 200% of their annual salary. So if you've got a manager who's making $45,000 a year, they estimated it would cost anywhere between that to $90,000 to replace them. Bliss & Associates, that really focused on salespeople, found that because it took longer to build those connections and the relationships in most selling jobs, that the actual cost of losing a salesperson was closer to 250% of their average salary. So we've got a variety of different ranges, but it's expensive no matter where you're looking at this. Average turnover costs, again, when you look at that meta-study, what you found is we tried to group it into 3 different areas. Those people who are making $30,000 or less, an average, typical American worker, what you find is it costs about 16.1% of their annual salary to replace them. If you make $50K or more, $50K or less, it's about almost 20%. But for those people who are making $75,000 up to that range, it goes over 20%. So you can see it gets more and more progressively expensive the more and more you make, and not just in terms of real dollars, in terms of percentages. So really what you look at here is that no matter how you slice it, it's expensive across different income ranges. Now, the additional impact of involuntary turnover, because it's not planned, tends to be significantly higher. IE Business School last February did a study that said that it looked at this over retail operations, and that really that involuntary in particular was related to had a significant impact on store productivity and efficiency, and it was really most pronounced, not too surprisingly, during the first month. So the more and more people got fired, the more and more you had impact, and it was short-term. You felt it right away. There's a significant amount of pain, typically in lost top-line revenue. When you look at the overall total cost of turnover in the United States, it starts to get staggering. The Contact Call Center Association estimated in 2011 that for a large call center, a place where, depending on what part of the country you're in, you may be sending a lot of clients, there may be a lot of demand. These places, they have high turnover because just the nature of the work, but also sometimes because people who go in there don't have some of the basics. We'll talk about that. But it can approach $2.8 million a year. Deloitte Consulting said that for most large companies overall, regardless of industry, it's $100 million across the United States for an operation. If you look and estimate these numbers nationwide, just if you take the most conservative estimate we did, which was $3,500 per employee, and you times that times the 20 million people who left work, that's over $30 billion nationwide that we lost due to turnover in 2012 alone. It's a staggering number. And again, the reason why it's important is because so much time, effort, and money goes in right now to preventing voluntary turnover, people who are choosing to leave. But very little is being done on that 42% who don't choose to leave but are being fired for cause because they don't understand what it takes in order to keep and maintain their employment. So that's a brief overview as we look at that. Just some additional things for you to know a little bit as we look at turnover. and go through some of the new numbers that are out there. We talked about the numbers in terms of involuntary turnover across the country. SHRM estimates every year nationwide right now, it's almost 10% involuntary turnover per year, which means that every business terminates 1 out of every 10 employees every single year, just on a consistent basis. And in some industries, specifically services and retail, those numbers go even double to that. And again, the reason why that's important is depending on which part of the country you're in, a lot of the entry-level positions that we may be training people for or trying to get people into have those highest levels of involuntary turnover because while we may be getting them some of the skills, they may not have these foundational behaviors. We're going to get into those as we talk about what causes involuntary turnover here in this next section. In the meantime, Bridget, I'm going to send it back out to you to see if we have any questions as we talk about the cost of turnover.
Okay, and again, this is a good time for you to type in some of your question. And from Maria, can you please repeat the cost of the turnover per employee?
Yeah, I can go back to the slides as well, but I'll just tell you right now, the short answer is it depends. Depends on who you talk to, but the numbers that we looked at from some of our different studies in terms of looking at this metadata that's out there, if you look here, and this is the best kind of slide for that, depends on the type of employee. SHRM estimated that the costs for turnover for an $8 an hour employee was $3,500 to replace them. American Management Association had a much higher figure because they looked more at those management and those those exempt positions that you may have, and that was 100 to 200%. Bliss and Associates, they're a firm that focuses on salespeople, and they found that their costs were closer to 250%. So it depends on who it is that you're talking about replacing, but the bottom line is no matter who it is really expensive to replace anyone, regardless of whether or not it's a senior executive or whether or not it's a frontline employee.
And if we needed any more reason to more closely align the focus of the staff that works with the job seekers and the staff that work with business and employer, this certainly would do it.
No question. And the business development people are out there trying to figure out what people are looking for and what they need. If we can keep employees, that's going to save every business money regardless of what they're in the business of, whether or not that's serving people, building something, shipping something, selling something. Every one of those businesses is going to benefit the fewer workers they have to have terminated.
This kind of is a nice segue into Jackie's question, which I think is a great question, and that is, what's the cost to the employers to fire for cause as opposed to layoff as it relates to the unemployment insurance?
It depends state by state. Generally speaking, we started to do a little bit of work in there, but because there were no really good numbers across the country, we don't have any concrete data there. But what you find is that, generally speaking, when you have to term people for cause, it increases your insurance rate, your unemployment insurance rates versus doing a layoff. And so what you're going to find is more and more companies are not in a position where they're going to do layoffs because of the business nature of the cycle. They're going to be more eliminating people because of cause. That's going to have a double impact. Not only are they going to have to cost to replace that person for turnover, but they're going to see these hidden back-end costs with higher insurance premiums for their unemployment insurance. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't have a good nationwide statistic for that, but we have lots of great anecdotal pieces. Unfortunately, none of them made it into the white paper for you, Jackie. So just know that that's what we found.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is a really good thing to be thinking about, too, when you're looking at the bigger picture. Do we have any other questions about what you've seen so far? And again, he's going to stop during the next after the next section as well, and you can ask some additional questions if they bubble up. I'm not seeing any at the moment, so I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Bridget. Well, really, the meat of what we started to find as we looked at what the costs were and why this was, no one was focusing on this before, was to figure out what really is driving this involuntary turnover. Why is it that people are being fired? You just ask most people, and they're like, well, they're being stupid. Well, that's not a really good scientific reason as to why someone is involuntarily termed or fired. So we want to do a little bit more research into that. And that's really where kind of the meat of this presentation and the meat of our research came. So we looked at why employees get fired. Patty English did a research and summed up the top 10 reasons why employees get fired based on a number of reports that she found during her research. And here's the top 10 list that she had. The number one reason that they had that people got fired was dishonesty or lack of integrity on the job. And one of the interesting things, and I'll put a plug in for the doing a breakout at the Next Out of conference there in Minneapolis, and we're talking about ethics in the workplace. And what you see is, regardless of which type of industry you're in, which area you're in, that line around workplace ethics is really critical. And no matter where you are, that's the number one reason why people get fired. By number two, closely behind it, again, this dishonesty, but this time even getting the job by lying on your resume, refusing to follow directions, inconsistency, inability to get along with others, inability to actually do assigned job tasks. They are absent all the time, and drug and alcohol abuse. What we noticed when we looked at this list is that really, when it all comes down to it, there are two categories here that were separated from the other ones. Numbers 7 and 8, which were the inability to do the assigned job tasks and performing the task slowly with multiple errors. Those were the only two that related to actually how well people did their job. The rest of them were workplace behaviors, not necessarily how well they did their job. Why that's important is because it became this sort of critical link and this critical question in the whole process, and that was this. Is it a skill or is it a will issue? And what we found time and time again in our research was that it's not the skills that is getting people fired. It's the will to do the job. It's the fact that they don't do these basic workplace behaviors. And that's becoming a growing trend that we're seeing. And unfortunately, as you'll see here in a moment, it's not limited, and it's something that is impacting industry across the board. So when you look at employees, one of the great pieces of research we found was in Forbes magazine from an organization that looked at 20,000 employees and measured them over 18 months, so a year and a half after they got their new jobs. And they wanted to see how many of those people after 18 months were still employed and how many had gotten fired. So just looked at voluntary versus involuntary versus stay. And what they found was staggering, that 46%, almost half of everyone who got a new job, had been discharged or fired within the first year and a half. Not that they quit, not that they got laid off. They were fired within 18 months of getting hired. Now, that's after a year and a half. SHRM was looking at some different things, as well as there's a study from PricewaterhouseCoopers that looks at first-year terminations to be approximately about 29% of all first-year hires, of all people hired, get terminated within the first year. So you see it go up to about 46%, but not too surprisingly, that's about two-thirds of that, or almost 30%, are fired within 1 year, which means that about 15% are going to be termed within the first 6 months. The reason that's important, especially for all of you out there in the workforce world, right, is you look at your WIA common measures, you want to make sure that you have job retention over the next 2 quarters, or approximately 6 months after they're employed. We're already having at least 15, if not higher than 15% of people get terminated involuntarily. It's not that they quit, it's that someone fires them.
Josh, is that for a specific age group, or is that across the board?
This is across the board, not only across age groups, but across industry and across employment. So this is both for entry-level employees all the way up to senior executives, which was one of the more staggering things that we found. But what was even more important as we looked at this study was why people got fired. And what they found is that if they were to look at, is it their attitude, is it what they do versus the skill, they asked them kind of, what was it that got them fired? That 89% of the time it was because of their behaviors, their attitude, not because they didn't actually have the skills to do the job. And that corresponds quite nicely actually with this, the Better Business research done by Patty Farmer that looked at about maybe 1 or 2 out of 10 in terms of the reason why people get fired. So this data, again, continues to back that up, that it's not a question of skill, it's a question of will. And the problem with that is because when it comes to skill development, we do a great job, right? Who's responsible for training people the basic skills in order to do their jobs, right? We've got education, whether or not that's at a secondary level community college, four-year school, advanced degree programs, education, CTE, right? We're doing a great job in that area. Workforce is doing a fantastic job of preparing people for the basic skills they need in order to be successful. And even corporate training is out there to give people the skills they need, whether or not that's in sales, whether or not that's in accounting, whether or not that's in programming, right? A lot of people are responsible for skill development, and we're doing a fantastic job. The problem becomes, who's responsible for will development? Who are the people who are out there who are helping get people those basic workplace behaviors so they can shape their attitudes? Well, when you look traditionally, who's responsible for will development? Number one source that people talk about are family, right? How are people connecting? You learned it from your family, you learned it from this. One of the most staggering statistics we've come across looked at the amount of time that a typical parent spends in meaningful dialogue with their children every single week, right? We're not talking about massive amounts of time, but just meaningful dialogue about anything other than, where's soccer practice? What are we eating for dinner? Would you walk the dog? What we found is that the average family spends less than 15 minutes in meaningful dialogue with their children a week. That's just over 2 minutes a day. Also, if you look at the amount of time that people in families children in families have been doing chores, it's been declining since 1970. So families are talking less and less about this, and they're acting on it less and less. And so people aren't learning will development in the family the way that we once thought they would. So who else is responsible for will development? Well, another place you might see is in the workplace, right? That's where a lot of people learn to work, is on that first job. They may go through some training. You've got orientation. They're going to teach you about the basics. They're going to do everything they can. Well, the American Society of Training and Development analyzed based on employee costs, where they saw all the training dollars going, and found that just over 4%, 4.1% of all training dollars spent in corporate America went towards developing these core skills. So, as we look at 95 cents, 96 cents out of every dollar goes to developing skill, not will. And that's really seeing an impact in the workplace. So you can hope that you have a good boss. You can hope that you can learn, because certainly companies are not putting money where their mouth is. They'd rather have people kind of weed themselves out and get themselves fired rather than spend the money on the front end. Why? Because training dollars are a hard cost. And again, as we said before, those turnover costs are hidden, so they don't necessarily see those costs on their bottom line, but they know exactly how much they're spending in training. And unfortunately, they're going to get bit in the end because of those costs. So the workplace isn't teaching these will development, and family isn't teaching it, right? Where's the third place that we can look? Society, right? When you look at society at large, unfortunately, as you can tell, we're not doing a great job of teaching the basics of work. We're in a get-rich-quick mentality. We're in a get as many hits as you can on YouTube, because that's how you're going to get famous. Everybody wants to try and have that quick hit, win the lottery. This idea of working hard for something, or even knowing what to do, is almost out the window. One of the favorite signs, I travel around the country and I get a chance to take pictures of different things that I see that I think are funny. This, I think, is the best statement I can about sort of society's view of the importance of working hard and doing everything you can in order to succeed. This is a sign for a bar and grill. My boss said to change the sign, so I did. You talk about doing the daily minimum requirement. This is exactly what happened. Now, yes, it's funny, but it's also a sad statement of where we are in terms of development of these basic workplace behaviors as a society. So, if family, workplace, and society aren't developing these skills, who's developing it? Well, the quick answer is no one. And that's why we're seeing these higher and higher levels of involuntary turnover that are costing our clients, costing our communities, and costing the companies that we work with. So, before we get into talking about some of the strategies for actually improving job retention and helping to teach people these basic workplace behavior wills, let's throw it back out to any questions that you might have out there. Bridget, any questions around the section of skill versus will?
Not so much a question, but a comment came from a couple of people when we're looking at where do individuals learn this. Mm-hmm. Several people also mentioned religious organizations or places of faith. Mm-hmm. A lot of them, and obviously that is a tenet of that environment as well.
One of the challenges, and I don't know any exact numbers, but one of the challenges, I would agree that religious institutions are a place that many people, has this faith, or a place that people learn some of these basic workplace behaviors. And you see across all mainline denominations shrinking numbers of attendees, whether or not that's in the Protestant faith, Catholic, Jewish communities, and so you're seeing a drop in attendance at religious services across the board. And so it's not surprising that even though that may be an effective approach, fewer and fewer people are being exposed to it as a result of that.
Right, right. A couple of people also mentioned they wanted to take your top 10 list, why people lost their job, and post it in their office. Use it as a handout for perhaps some of the customers that come in, or as a talking point when they are working with an employer.
I think that's a great place, because it's one of those things that, sort of instinctively any manager or business person knows. But to see it right there in front of you is a great way to kind of just go, yeah, this is the problem, and this is why these things happen. And, the reality is in a lot of different organizations, people, just as they're out there, just don't know these basics. And as a result, they think there's some gray lines, or they don't understand that there's going to be a consequence for this. And the reality is that they're important, and there's a reason for them.
Right. A lot of people just have not been exposed anymore, and I think it's terrific that you are giving us examples and backing it up with research. So we've all felt this in our gut, but now we've got it backed up by actual research as well. A question came in about what about a pre-screening of psychometric assessments that screen for these type of abilities, and that's coming in from Don.
Well, Don, there's a variety of different programs that are out there, and I'm not here to sell anyone, but there are some of those different screening techniques and screening tools. One of the organizations that we've encountered is an organization called HR GEMS, and they have the nation's only psychometrically valid work ethic integrity assessment, which is really good for those of you who are doing anything in the government sector. Since it's psychometrically validated, what that means, right, is that it doesn't discriminate based on any of the protected classes or areas. So what you'll see there is employers are using it as a screening tool to protect themselves against this, and finding that one of the interesting things is, in a typical assessment, you're trying to get, figure out maybe 50% of the people pass and do that. In their assessment, consistently across the board, they find that only 10 to 15% of people get green-lighted in the work ethic integrity assessment.
Wow. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And for a lot of the organizations, what they ended up having to do, because it's sort of a three-tier approach, they use a red light, yellow light, green light approach, they had to start interviewing yellow light people because they just couldn't find enough available candidates in that green light.
Wow, wow. And for Maria, have you found in your research information that we at our agencies can share with our clients to help them to believe that will can be more important than skill? Maybe companies sharing their thoughts about that?
Other than the statistics we have for you right now, we don't have anything. I think the real powerful one is that the study that was reported in Forbes, that 89% of the reason why people get fired is because of attitude or will rather than skill. But I want to say this. I don't think it's more important. Some people would argue otherwise, that it is more important. I think it's equally important. The challenge is, if you remember back, right, we're doing a great job in our education system and in our workforce system and in the business and with a lot of the community providers in helping to teach people job skills. We've got a great real network of ways for people to learn how to do jobs. The challenge is that we don't have that same network developed for how to teach people how to behave and how to learn these basics of just what it means to actually keep a job. Mm-hmm. And that's really where we're falling down more than anything else. So I welcome some of those, but we don't have anything beyond that in this. But maybe I think that may be a good topic for our next white paper.
Absolutely, and you just released this. Several folks have asked if you could repeat the name of the company with the psychometrically valid work ethic assessment.
Yes, it's called.
With the caveat that we're not here to push any particular assessment, and there might be others out there that are good.
Yes, I will definitely vouch for that. As far as I know, they're the only ones that have a psychometrically valid work ethic integrity, but there are lots of other things to measure in assessments that could be helpful in this process. So I'll throw that as a caveat, and there's lots of places to look. But the company is called HR GEMS, and the website is hrgems.com. So HR like human resources and gems like the stone, GEMS.com.
And I'm just going to throw in a comment as well. If you are looking for assessments, make sure that you dig a little deeper and that make sure that there's been some psychometric testing on them. Anyone can put anything out there and say it's an assessment, but that doesn't mean that it's a good assessment. So make sure that you do due diligence when you're evaluating that they've done some background work on the psychometrics and validated it for the use in which you're going to use it as well.
Which is really important.
There's tons of stuff all over the internet. It just doesn't mean that they're good.
Exactly. Just for those of you out there who are in the practitioner field, one of the interesting things, we're doing a pilot partnering with the Jefferson County Workforce Center in Jefferson County, Colorado. It's a suburban county outside of Denver. And we're using that, one of their assessments, as a pre-screening tool for clients when they come in to determine, kind of as a triage, to determine whether or not they move into a rapid attachment or what other services that they may want to get before they're deemed job ready. So we're working on the details of it, but there's a lot of creative ways you can use those kinds of assessments.
And I don't have any additional questions at this time.
All right, great. Well, let's talk about, now that we're back, understanding that it's not just doing a job, but knowing what and why a job, why to do a job that's important. Let's talk about some of the ways that we can improve that and learn some of those basic skills. One of the things that you hear about in this country a lot is this skills gap, right? People are talking about there's all these jobs that are out there. What we started to discover in our research was that it was beyond, there was a level beyond just a skills gap in terms of hard skills, but there was what's called sort of the soft skills gap. And when you look at different skills, people just don't have them. Whether or not it's from Sherm, again, saying that 40% of employers lack basic high school skills. One of the interesting things I thought was James Heckman, who's a Nobel laureate, and he talked about the importance of these, and he said that it's more important and more critical to job success than having a college degree. And I thought that was just staggering to think about. The industry where I had worked before was the hospitality industry, and some of our most successful general managers there had a philosophy that was hire for attitude, train for skills, in that they felt confident that they could teach anybody how to do some of these jobs, but what they can't teach, right, is this attitude, this ability to do this, to love their job, to know what to do. And so our responsibility is to get those skills to them and make sure that they've got the right people to make that happen. Now, when you looked at soft skills, what we found is that it really kind of broke down into two different categories. We oftentimes lump soft skills all into sort of one all-encompassing bucket. It's got all these different elements to it. We typically look at soft skills, right? Communication, diversity, leadership, right? Some of these things, we call them soft skills because they're difficult to really measure. They're kind of these intangibles. But what we found is that there was a level below those that were really foundational behaviors. Not soft skills so much, but just these behaviors that were even more critical, right? Communication and teamwork are great, but if you don't have attendance right, you don't show up, it really doesn't matter how good your teamwork is because you're not present, right? Diversity is great, but if you've got no accountability to yourself, it really doesn't matter what you know about diversity because you're not going to take any personal responsibility. So these foundational behaviors at the bottom, we found, were actually even more critical to the success of the soft skills, which then led to success in these hard skills and in job performance overall. The 7 foundational behaviors we found really made up what we call work ethic: attitude, attendance, appearance, ambition, acceptance, accountability, and appreciation. Those were just kind of the core things, and we found that in doing research with 1,500 different employers, that these were the skills that they found to be the best predictors of success in their existing and in future employers. Now, the challenges with these kind of these work ethic behaviors, this foundational level of behavior, is there's a lot of misconceptions about it. One of the biggest misconceptions we say, yeah, people just, they just need to work harder. The problem with people is they're just not working hard anymore. But the reality is that while you may think that, the statistics show exactly the opposite. When you look at productivity per employee, and you take it all the way back to 1973, what you're seeing here is that business productivity is increased every single year during that time over a linear fashion. Right? Even during recessions, even during boom times, we're seeing higher and higher productivity. It's not that people are working less or being more lazy. And so the secret to learning work ethic isn't simply putting in more hours. It's deeper than that, and that's why all 7 of those behaviors were so important. The second misconception we have around work ethic that we found with people is that it's something you just learn as a kid. A lot of people tell you, hey, if you didn't learn this by the time you're 8 or 10 or 12 or whatever that age is, you're never going to have it. And what we found, in fact, was that that's not the case. Not only is it something that can be learned, but more often than not, what happens is that people get put in situations that cause them to have this perception of lack of work ethic. It's their situation, not necessarily them themselves. This is illustrated, I think, really well by modern-day philosopher Scott Adams. Maybe some of you don't know Scott Adams' quotes directly, but I'll sure you recognize him as the author of the Dilbert cartoons. Here's one example he has about some of the misconceptions of work ethic. It starts out with this woman behind a desk talking to, of course, everyone's favorite boss guy. Right, what does our CEO do if he gets a good, what does he get if he does a good job? Well, he gets a $50 million bonus, the boss says. She asks then again, what do I get if I do a good job? More work. What's your guess about why I'm not motivated? Bad genes. Right. The reality is she's not motivated because she's got bad genes, despite what this bad boss may think. She's not motivated because the system has really put her in a position where instead of getting incentives, she's being decentivized to do more and better work. And you see this across society in different places. There are unintended consequences that are out there. So that it's not that people don't know the skills, and it's not that they don't necessarily know these things. They've been put in situations where doing these behaviors in the past has been seen as punishment or has been a demotivator rather than seen as a tool for success. The final misconception is it isn't something that you can learn. In fact, even training and development professionals oftentimes have this misconception. Here's a quote from David Murphy, who works for IT trainers. He said, if a person doesn't come here with the right attitude, no amount of training is going to make them an effective long-term hire. Right? He thinks he can't do it. He thinks all he can do is teach IT skills. And I'm confident that David is a fantastic trainer in that area. But the reality is if we put ourselves into this situation where we believe we can't do something or we don't try to do it, I can guarantee you we are going to fail, and we will definitely be unsuccessful. Now, the challenge is this, though. Traditional classroom training isn't as effective in developing the foundational attitudes and values in order to drive these long-term behavioral change. In fact, if you look, one of the things from a study from the Research and Analysis Bureau last year said it was harder to find employees with positive work habits than it was basic writing, technology, and math skills. Why? Because we focus so much on traditional classroom training techniques, which do a fantastic job of teaching those skills. The problem is that traditional classroom training techniques and rote memorization is not an effective technique for developing the behavioral will and these workplace behaviors that you need in order to produce long-term success. So what is the key to developing work ethic? What we found is that instead of these traditional rote memorization techniques, that you need to do 3 different things. Number 1, there had to be experiential learning. There had to be an opportunity for participants to actually experience, live, and learn from particular exercises in order to be effective. Second of all, that it worked best in a peer-to-peer model. One of the challenges on the workplace is that there's oftentimes, right, as we talked about in the Dilbert cartoon, there are these situations and these scenarios where people are discouraged from working, and sometimes that's a peer basis. So rather than using peer pressure for a negative, what we found is that environments where they use peer-to-peer learning and peer pressure on a positive basis, they achieve better results. And a key third element is that it has to be applicable and flexible. You can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. It really has to be one-size-fits-one and find ways to make it culturally, economically, and personally relevant to people. I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on each one of these 3, and then I'm going to end with 5 different strategies that regardless of who you are or what you're doing, you should be able to incorporate in order to help people develop these wills and these work ethic behaviors so that you can be more successful in helping them keep jobs. So, experiential learning. Really, when you look at it, it's been going on for a variety of different ways. The research began around the 1950s around this model, looking at 4 different key concepts around experiential learning. You have to have the experience. You then observe and kind of reflect back on that. Then you take those and create some abstract conceptions and concepts out of it, and then you test those things out. You have an experience, You think about what happened, you reflect on it, you talk with other people, a really critical part of it. You figure out how you might be able to apply something from that learning, and then you put it back into practice. And then from there, you have another experience, and the circle continues over and over again. This experiential learning process is critical in developing these workplace behaviors because it teaches people not just what to do, but why it's important. And that why step is something that we found was oftentimes missing in that traditional classroom training, but was so critical in learning these skills. Another piece, as we talk about experiential learning, are some of the ways that you can do it. Some things to remember. Number one, adults, despite what you may try and pretend, are really just babies with big bodies. Right? When we are babies, when we're kids, even into kindergarten and pre-K, well, the way we learn is by doing. Right? We get in, we get muddy, we go into the sandbox, we do these basics, right? The reality is, even as we become older and as adults, we still learn well by doing, and that's what experiential learning talks about. Another thing to remember in experiential learning is that people don't argue with their own data. When they've felt something, when they've experienced something themselves, they are more likely than ever to not just embrace it, but to defend it, where even if you had told them what to do and told them why it was important, just telling them is not going to get them to accept it. Because they create their own conclusions, they create their own facts, they then become defenders of those facts rather than trying to prove why they're wrong. Third thing that's important about experiential learning is that it's, I hate to tell you this, but it's fun. Experiential learning is a lot more fun than sitting behind a desk getting lectured or even sitting on your computer and attempting to do a webinar, right? And what we found is that learning is directly proportional to the amount of fun that you have. The more fun you're having doing something, the less you take your barriers down. And as adult learners in particular, that's very important in getting people to accept new approaches to doing old things. Next, let's talk a little bit about peer-to-peer learning. The idea here is that peers teach each other, and they provide scenarios and examples about how things work in their world. They can use a language that's more appropriate. And more importantly, peer-to-peer learning provides what we call a second voice. So instead of just hearing it from the instructor, you truly create a dialogue in class, and you get people talking with each other and creating a far more credible and oftentimes effective approach to learning. Next thing, of course, uses this idea of peer pressure. And instead of using peer pressure as a negative, finds ways to use those positive ways to influence the norms and the mores of the group. And for those of you who are doing training, whether it's a faith-based community, at a one-stop, right, you're going to have diverse people in there from different backgrounds in your community. And what's great about this is that they can then take these lessons back into their particular subgroups and start to be using this as peer pressure even in those environments, and because it becomes part of their new shared norm. Finally, this idea of flexibility and applicability, this is critically important for adult learners because what you have to be able to do is speak to them. You know, adult learners in particular, if you don't make it immediately relevant to them, they will shut down. And that's the problem with a lot of this traditional training that you see, is that you just give this basic scenarios, and it's this one-size-fits-all approach, as I said before. The reality is it needs to be customized so that people can experience it and speak in their language and have it be relevant to what they've done over their life. For those of you who are working with displaced workers, especially those in their 50s, early 60s, right, this is a really big challenge for people because they're in a place where they've built up a lifetime of experiences. And if you don't value that, if you don't value what they bring to the table, you are not going to be successful in getting them any new information. It ensures that it's applicable for all appropriate audiences, and it's really important because each of you may be dealing with different people from different sectors of your community across the, in terms of even having it in one class, let alone across the different offerings that you have. So finding a way to make it appropriate for each member and to speak that language is critically important. So let me end this section of the webinar and with 5 techniques for application, and then we're going to go off and answer some more questions. But these are really, this is the meat here I want to get to at the end and talk about how you can apply some of these techniques around experiential learning, peer-to-peer or collaborative learning, and an adaptive and flexible environment, how you can take those concepts and use them in specific applicable techniques for everyone who teaches any sort of workshop, any sort of counseling, or anything else that you're doing with this population, because these techniques work and they can be used by you. First thing you need to do is become participant focused. And this is really challenging for those of us, myself included, who are professional trainers, because we'd love to think beyond everything else that we are the fountain of all wisdom and that we know everything there is to know, and that really it's a privilege for you to be in my program because I am that good. Have you seen my evaluations? Everybody loves me. The reality is the more you're focused on yourself, the less your class is going to learn. And it seems very basic, but one of the best expressions I ever heard was, the more you are a guide from the side and the less you are a sage from the stage, the more effective you're going to be. When you can get off your soapbox and instead of giving all the answers, find a way to throw it back to the participants, let them be the ones driving the experience, the more effective it's going to be, and you'll find the more rewarding it's going to be for you as a trainer, a counselor, or a facilitator. Next thing, use the Socratic method. Right, this is a great approach just in general when you're doing any sort of piece, because it helps you be more participant-focused and at the same time really drives this peer-to-peer learning. Right, the Socratic method goes back to Socrates, so I'd love to say that I invented this or invented this term, but trust me, we've been doing this for thousands of years. The Socratic method, very simply, is instead of you answering everyone's questions, when someone asks a question to you, you throw it back to the group, or just initially even throw it to the group. So if someone asks you, so why is this important? Why is it so important, that I need to make sure that I show up to work on time? As long as I'm there within 15 minutes, it doesn't matter at all. So instead of you saying, well, the company policy is that it's 15 minutes, and most places will fire you, instead throw it back to someone else and say, well, that's an interesting question. Have you ever had a time when you were at work and one of your coworkers was late? What happened? How did that make you feel? What was it like? Were you unable to go pick up your daughter? Could you not drop off your kid for band practice? Did you miss your bus and end up having to spend an extra hour? Right? These are the kind of things, when you pass it back, it allows people to share that learning and to really, again, become participant and peer-to-peer rather than all this monologue just from you as that talking head. Third thing that's a great strategy is to create what's called accountability partners. And of course, accountability is one of the 7 workplace behaviors that we talk about that people don't know. And this is kind of a sneaky way that people can really develop this without necessarily knowing that they're learning it. What you do is you pair people up or put them into triads or groups of 4 and set different metrics for them, right? Whether it's returning from breaks or if you're doing a multi-day event, making sure that everyone has their homework done or whatever else. And your team only gets points if everyone on your team accomplishes a certain task, or your team loses points if certain people don't do things. And at the end, you have a prize, even if the prize is just a round of applause or a candy bar or something like that for a team that has the most points. Now they're accountable not only to themselves, but everyone in their teams. An interesting offshoot of this I found, I was doing some interviews, and one of the interviews I was doing was with a station manager at Southwest Airlines. And he was a station manager for one of their counters at one of the airports. I won't mention which one. But he created accountability partners and did that. He said, everybody here, you're going to be paired up with somebody else. And for this month, if you call off, if you don't show, if you're late, right, there are all these points that you could lose. And he said, at the end of the month, whichever team has the most points wins whatever prize it was. And I think it was 2 airplane tickets. That part's unimportant. What is important is what he said next. He said, what's going to make this different is I know, and I've already pulled out who everyone's partner is, but they're going to be your ghost partner. You don't know who in this room is your partner. And so now all of a sudden, instead of being accountable just to one person, everyone was inherently accountable to everyone else on that team. It was a very effective way to create accountability, to reinforce this message. But the more ways you can find to do this, the more effective you'll be. Next, this is a critical piece in everything that you do. We can't spend enough time doing this, and yet at the same time, we find ourselves so focused on the what that we don't spend enough time focusing on the why. What gets us short-term behavioral change? Why gets us lasting improvement? What we found over and over again in these these foundational behaviors was that people needed to understand the why behind the what. And when they did, they started to embrace it. They started to live it, and it became part of who they were. So the more you can focus on the why, regardless whether it's foundational behaviors, specific tasks, and skills, Go out of your way to remind people. And even going back to number 2, right, the Socratic method, remind them, ask them, why is this so important? That will really help you drive this home. Finally, one of the things that I think is really important in this entire process is what I call the platinum rule. As we talk about flexibility and adaptability, this is a great way to sort of take it home and to use just a basic principle. You know, like many people, I was raised in a religious household and we learned, you know, the golden rule. What's interesting is if you look across all world religions, regardless of whether or not it's a mainstream or whether or not it's even a smaller religion, all of them have, as part of their dogma, some version of the golden rule, right? Which is to treat others as you want to be treated. The reality, however, is what this implies is that everybody wants the same things you do, or learns the same way you do, or has the same goals that you do. In reality, that's never true. Or if it is true, it's true in a very small percentage. So what we talk about is going beyond the golden rule, and instead going to something a little higher. Yes, that's right, the platinum rule. And the platinum rule is all about treating others the way they want to be treated, teaching others the way they want to be trained, communicating in a way they want to be communicated with. So many of us are, again, focused on, hey, this is how I do things. This is how I operate. Well, if we want to make things better for the people that we're working with, we need to do what's best for them in the environment that's best for them. And that may require us to give up a little bit of the control we thought we needed before in order to make that more effective. So, become more participant-focused. Use the Socratic method. Find and create accountability partners and accountability systems. Focus on training the why, and then treat others the way they want to be treated. Those are our 5 techniques that we find that everyone can use in terms of applying the lessons from our white paper, Whose Job Is It Anyway? So, I'll open it now up to questions, and I'll put the slide up again that's got my information. I want to, just before we get into those final questions, thank you all for attending. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this information and hope that you can find it and take it back. I will also at this time do a very quick plug. I wanted to let you know that here at the Center for Work Ethic Development, we are looking for somebody who comes from this community who would be interested in a business development role that we have, trying to reach out and help other people learn and implement some of what we've done. If you know one of your colleagues or friends who's left the industry recently or is looking for something new, feel free to send them my email. We're looking for somebody specifically who understands kind of the community that we work in here at NADP with our professionals in our community. So with that, Bridget, I will pass it over to you for final questions.
Okay, and this is a really good time to get the last couple of questions in. And there's a lot of takeaways today, obviously, about how ethics, as defined in this presentation, have a major role in job retention. It is incredibly teachable. In fact, we've had a couple of examples. And let's face it, workforce professionals are in an ideal situation to be able to really bring this point home in a lot of the workshops and interactions that we have, both with our employer customers and also our job seeker customers as well. I'm going to do a quick plug for Josh as well. For those of you who are coming to the annual conference in Minneapolis, I have asked the Center for Work Ethic Development and Josh to do what I'm calling a deep dive, which is sort of a back-to-back session where we can go through some of these issues on work ethics more fully. This is only a webinar. You can only really, go across the top of the waves. But, thinking about that experiential model, you'll be able to attend that if you would like to as well. Let's see. Recommended book. Whoops, if I can actually get back to here. Sorry about this. There's a couple of questions that have come in. I will be sending out a link with the recording of today's webinar and the PowerPoint presentation and the white paper to everyone. Give me a day or so to get everything posted. A recommendation for a book, Telling Ain't Training, for anyone who wants a deeper look at adult learning in a very readable and non-scholastic presentation. I think that was from Dawn, so thank you very much. I think a lot of us like to trade books back and forth. There's some really great stuff out there as well. Let's see, a couple of things. When we're thinking about people and programs that do this well, I'm going to take control for just one second here. I just want to highlight a couple of things in the last couple minutes we have, and feel free to keep putting your questions in as well. On our website, nawdp.org, the center is actually a strategic alliance with NAWDP. So if you're interested in finding out more about what they do, or maybe having them come in and do some specialized training for you, you can access a lot of this information on our website at any time. And for those of you who work with outstanding professionals who are doing this and working with their customers day in and day out, this is a good opportunity to really recognize them through our awards program. And I'm highlighting this only because the deadline is tomorrow. So if you have some folks that you're thinking about who really apply some of these things in what they do, they may be just the right people to nominate for one of our awards. Do we have any other questions coming in? I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I definitely want to thank you for taking the time. Josh, today this was a great presentation. I know I was taking lots of notes, and I think that you presented it in such a format that we can really use it. And for those of you who have not read the white paper yet, and I've had the privilege of reading it, there's really great information in there that you can use as a discussion point during staff and in-service meetings, and also just as a way to start the conversation with some of your employers. Some great opportunities to improve both of our youth programs, and if you're working with a program with adults who some of these issues may be new to. They may not necessarily have had the luxury of learning about work ethics in the home. So it's our opportunity to help strengthen that.
And I will tell you this, one of the interesting things we've found here at the center where we're actually getting the most response and sort of feedback on the need to teach these work ethic development skills is actually with displaced workers. Mm-hmm. It's people who have been in the workforce and, you know, as a result of either being in a bad situation or just being burnt out or different things, have forgotten why these basics are so important. And so they're actually finding that those workers, that population is the one that they're having the most need to relearn these skills, or in this case, these wills.
Right, absolutely, and it's always a good reminder for our own staff. We are a profession of individuals and human beings, so it's a great reminder for our own workforce staff as we're working with our customers as well. So I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. I want to thank everyone for spending the last 75 minutes with us. We know your time is incredibly valuable, and we hope that you have a terrific afternoon the rest of the week. And as I indicated before, I will be following up with everyone with some additional information as well. And we might be even able to talk Josh into doing some additional webinars for us.
Well, we need to look at the opportunity, but you know, this is such a critical audience in terms of being able to really drive change across the country. And so I thank you again for the opportunity to get a chance to talk to anybody. If anyone has any other questions after the session, again, feel free to email me. I'm leaving the country here next week, but I'll be on email even during that time so I can help answer some of those questions as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. And with that, I am going to end today's session.
Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.